Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Elven Artificer, Meria Scholar of Antiquity. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see who won last week's poll and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Meria Scholar of Antiquity is a 3/3 elf artificer that costs 1, a red and a green, and has the following abilities. Tap an untapped non-token artifact we control to produce a green mana, or tap 2 untapped non-token artifacts we control instead to exile a top card of our library, allowing us to play that card until the end of the turn. Breaking down her core stats, Meria possesses a relatively low CMC, a typical stat block for her cost, and a pair of terrifyingly powerful artifact-focused abilities that provide both substantial ramp and draw to any artifact-centric build. Taking a closer look at her first ability, it's immediately reminiscent of Urza Lord High Artificer, with the added limitation that it can't be used with non-token artifacts to prevent it from being as abusable with treasures and other forms of artifact token generation. As it turns out, however, this fixed version of Urza's ability is still incredibly powerful, turning every single artifact in R99 into a mana rock and CMC 0 artifacts into Mox Emeralds, providing insane amounts of ramp to any build she helms. And if that wasn't enough, her second ability then turns those same artifacts into sources of card advantage, albeit temporary card advantage in the form of impulse draw. Still, even with only a limited window to use it, card advantage is still card advantage, and the fact that Meria can turn mana rocks, utility artifacts, and others into draw at no mana cost with no limit makes this ability quite a potent source of repeatable draw. So, it would appear that Meria is quite a powerful artifact-focused commander, despite what her Gruul color identity would suggest, providing both very potent ramp and draw to artifact-focused builds with her abilities. Which is why in this build, we'll be striving to get the maximum value out of said abilities, by running large numbers of low-cost and even free artifacts that are situational at best but our commander can turn into powerful sources of value, artifacts that can easily untap themselves to be used by Meria over and over again, and sources of artifact cost reduction to ensure we can get even more artifacts into play as quickly as possible. But while having access to huge amounts of ramp and draw from the command zone is excellent, it won't be winning any games by itself. So we'll be adding in both damaging artifact payoffs that will burn down our opponent's life totals as we inundate the board with artifacts, as well as combo pieces that may seem innocuous at first, but once assembled will allow us to instantly wipe out our opponent's life totals in one fell swoop. And lastly, as Meria is going to be drawing as much ire from our opponents as Urza himself, we'll be including plenty of artifact means to keep her alive, which will not only ensure she sticks around for as long as possible, but will also double up as additional sources of ramp and draw as we draw into them later. Now, let's turn this Artificer's considerable technological might against our opponents. Though she hails from the forests of Yavimaya, Meria's fascination with Thran technology have produced innovations that have protected both her people and the forest itself time and time again. And now, with the threat of new Phyrexia not only threatening her home but the entirety of the plane, she has joined Joda and the Coalition, bringing to bear the same Thran weaponry that was used against Yawgmoth himself all those millennia ago against this new Phyrexian threat. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting off in the CMC 0 slot, we'll be running the 3 artifact creatures Memnite, Phyrexian Walker, and Ornithopter, being a 1/1, a 0/3, and a 0/2 flyer respectively, but their stats being largely irrelevant to us, as we're far more concerned with Meria turning them into pseudo Mox Emeralds and card draw for us to fuel our game plan, allowing us to chew through our deck at a breakneck pace. It's then on to the CMC 1 slot and its 2 entrants, Dragon Rage Channeler and Goblin Welder. Dragon Rage Channeler is a 1/1 that, whenever we cast a non-creature spell, lets us surveil, in addition to gaining +2/+2 flying and being forced to attack each turn if we have 4+ different card types in our graveyard, which will be primarily running for the surveil to help us dig through our deck for our win cons as we cast our artifacts. Goblin Welder is another 1/1 that we can tap and sack an artifact to return another artifact from its owner's graveyard back into play, making it a great way to reanimate combo pieces or utility artifacts that may have been destroyed or sent to the grave previously, or just to swap out a tapped artifact for an untapped one for Meria to make use of as further ramp or draw. Moving on to the CMC2 slot, we have some additional non-artifact entrants joining us with Goblin Engineer, Reckless Fireweaver, and Firebrand Archer. Goblin Engineer is a 1/2 that, when it ETBs, lets us send an artifact from our deck to our graveyard, and lets us pay a red, tap it, and sack an artifact to return a CMC3 or less artifact from our graveyard back into play. Its graveyard tutoring effect making it a superb means to fetch up our combo pieces, which then either it or our other graveyard reanimation sources can bring into play for us. Reckless Fireweaver and Firebrand Archer are a 1/3 and 2/1 respectively that deal 1 damage to each opponent, the former doing so whenever an artifact ETBs under our control, and the latter whenever we cast a non-creature spell, both taking full advantage of our cheap artifact suite to pile on the damage to all our opponents as we continuously play and cast them. Then closing out this slot, we have Mere Retriever, a 1/1 that, when it dies, returns another artifact from our graveyard back to hand, serving as another source of artifact recursion for the build to use that we can use as a mana rock or draw in the meantime. Then reaching the CMC3 slot, we have our last non-artifact creature, Ingenious Artillerist, a 3/1 that, whenever one or more artifacts ETB under our control, deals that much damage to each opponent, effectively making it another copy of Reckless Fireweaver to pile on the damage even more as we play, cast, and recur our artifacts. It's then on to some artifact supporting artifact entrants with Foundry Inspector, Scrap Trawler, and Shimmermere. Foundry Inspector is a 3/2 that reduces the cost of all our artifact spells by 1, making it that much easier to cast any artifacts we impulse draw to give Meria even more tools to work with. Scrap Trawler is a 3/2 that, whenever it or another artifact we control is sent from the field to the grave, lets us return an artifact of lesser CMC from our grave to hand, turning all our artifacts into sources of recursion so we can get our resources back as our opponents start destroying them. Shimmermere is a 2/2 with Flash that lets us cast our artifact spells at flash speed, giving us the option to go off on our opponent's turns or in response to their removal, allowing us to play around their interactions much easier. Battered Golem then wraps up this slot, being a 3/2 that doesn't untap during our untap step, but lets us untap it whenever an artifact comes into play, synergizing spectacularly with our commander as we tap it down for ramp or draw, then immediately untap it as we play our next artifact to do so again. Nearing the end now, the CMC4 slot brings us 2 more artifact entrants in the form of Joyra's Familiar and Traxos Scourge of Krug. Joyra's Familiar is a 2/2 flyer that reduces the cost of all our historic spells by 1, giving us another way to make our artifacts cheaper to again make casting them back to back as we impulse draw them much less mana intensive. Traxos is a 7/7 trampler that comes into play tapped and doesn't untap during our untap step, instead untapping whenever we cast a historic spell, making him the upgraded version of Battered Golem to give us even more self-untapping shenanigans, and, on a field with both of them at the same time, will keep drawing us cards so long as we keep hitting artifacts. And finally, reaching the CMC5 slot and our last artifact creature, we have Kuldrotha Forgemaster, a 3/5 that we can tap and sack 3 artifacts to put an artifact from our deck into play, providing our build with the means to scrap our low-cost artifacts to tutor our combo pieces directly onto the battlefield, often winning us the game on the spot when it does so. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. We don't have too many entrants in this category, with the CMC1 slot consisting of Galvanic Blast, which deals 2 damage to any target, or 4 instead if we control 3+ artifacts, and Nature's Claim, which destroys target artifact or enchantment and gives its controller 4 life, both being dirt cheap removal to help us deal with problematic threats. Then skipping to the CMC3 slot, we have our last instant with Beast Within, which destroys target permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it, providing our build with a spectacular removal option to deal with most types of permanent threats that would otherwise stall out our game plan. That covers all our instants, and since this build has no sorceries, let's move straight to our enchantments. Skipping directly to the CMC3 slot, we have our only enchantment entry with Girapor Aether Grid, which lets us untap 2 untapped artifacts we control to deal 1 damage to any target, enabling us to weaponize our large amount of artifacts to use as removal or burn, and, once we've assembled a combo that lets us untap our artifacts indefinitely, can be used to instantly wipe out our opponent's life totals. That covers our lone enchantment, so let's move on to our artifacts. Starting off in the CMC 0 slot, we have quite a number of artifacts we're running primarily because they're free but may have some niche uses, such as the equipment a Quarter Shield and Cathar Shield, both of which equip for 3 and grant the equipped creature +0/+3 as well as Vigilance to make our commander or other payoffs into better blockers, as well as Bonesaw, which equips for 1 and grants the equipped creature +1/+0 for a slight offensive edge, and Spider Silk Net, which equips for 2 and grants the equipped creature +0/+2 and reach to help it intercept flying threats. From there, we have some utilitarian artifacts, starting with Tormod Script, which we can tap and sack to exile all cards from all players' graveyards in case we need to deal with some graveyard-focused builds, Herbal Poultice and Welding Jar, both of which we can sack to regenerate a target, the former costing 3 to do so and targeting creatures, while the latter costs nothing to use and targets artifacts, making them both decent means at keeping our high-value targets alive, and Ever-Flowing Chalice, which has Multi-Kicker 2, comes into play with a charge counter on it for every time it was kicked, and taps for a colorless mana equal to the number of charge counters on it, either making it a free artifact early or a big mana rock and combo piece later depending on when we draw into it. And then running down our remaining 0 drops that have no real value outside of being free to work alongside Meria, we have Zurin Orb, Claws of Gix, and Fountain of Youth, which just gain us 1 life by either sacking lands, paying 1 and sacking permanents, or paying 2 and tapping it respectively, Spellbook, which removes our maximum hand size when most of our card advantage is Impulse Draw, and Darksteel Relic, which is just an indestructible artifact and nothing else. All of which we're running not because of their own abilities, but because with Meria on board, they effectively become Mox Emeralds that we can tap to draw, still making them well worth the inclusion. It's then on to the CMC 1 slot, where we start off with some ramp sources in the form of Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble, the former tapping for 2 colorless, and the latter letting us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, both serving as cheap and reliable ramp in the early game, and later as cheap additional artifacts we can use to draw. We'll also be running Traveler's Amulet and Wanderer's Twig, both of which we can pay 1 and sack to put a basic land from our deck into our hand, not being quite ramp but still getting us lands in the early game to make our land drops, which is relevant considering our smaller than usual land base, while still doubling as ramp or card advantage if we draw into them in the later game. Then quickly going over our other utility artifacts in this slot, we have Codex Shredder, which we can tap to mill target player for 1 or pay 5, tap it and sack it to put a card from our grave back into our hand, which will be primarily running for the recursion but can be used as a win con to mill out our opponents. Experimental Synthesizer, which, when it enters or leaves play, exiles a top card of our deck and lets us play it until end of turn, as well as letting us pay 2 a red and sack it at sorcery speed to create a 2/2 with Vigilance, effectively cantripping as it comes down and having a built-in way to do so again that also nets us a body if needed. Lens of Clarity, which lets us look at the top card of our deck and face down creatures we don't own at any time, reducing the risk of blind drawing cards off the top when we're running low on mana. Sentinel Totem, which scries 1 when it ETBs and we can tap and exile to exile all cards from all graveyards for even more graveyard hate. Pyrite Spellbomb, which we can pay a red and sack to deal 2 damage to any target, or 1 and sack to draw a card, allowing us to use it as a cantrip or a shock as needed. And Voyager Staff, which we can pay 2 and sack to exile target creature and return it into play at the end of the turn, making it a solid way to protect Meria from removal and wipes. Then closing out this slot, we have Voltaic Key, which we can pay 1 and tap to untap target artifact. Its effect not appearing to be too impressive at first glance, but in reality being the centerpiece for combos that allow us to untap our artifacts indefinitely, which when combined with Meria effectively gives us infinite draw and mana to dig through our deck for other win cons and close out games. The CMC 2 slot then starts us off with some mana rocks, those being Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Gruul Signet, which we can pay 1 and tap for both our colors, and Mind Stone, which taps for a colorless and we can pay 1, tap it and sack it to draw a card, all serving as additional early ramp to get Meria out quickly that we can then use to draw cards or cast spells as needed. Then the Equipment Protection Suite consisting of Swiftfoot Boot, Mirror Shield, and Mask of Avacyn get added into our artifact lineup as we move deeper into this slot, all 3 granting the equipped creature hexproof, the first equipping for 1 and also granting it haste, the second equipping for 2, granting the equipped creature +0/+2 and destroying any creature with death touch that blocks it or it blocks, and the last equipping for 3 and granting the equipped creature +1/+2, all providing our commander with solid targeted removal protection to keep her alive for as long as possible. We'll also be running Cloak and Dagger in this category, another equipment that equips for 3, grants the equipped creature +2/+0 and Shroud, also equipping to rogues for free when they ETB, but that not seeing any use in this build, as we're just running it as another way to keep Meria from being targeted by our opponent's removal. Then running down the remaining artifacts in this slot, we're running Eye of Vecna, which when it ETBs has us pay 2 life to draw a card, in addition to letting us pay 2 and 2 life on our upkeep to draw an additional card, making it a cantrip initially that later turns into card advantage as turns progress. Ichor Wellspring, which when it ETBs or goes to the graveyard from play draws us a card, providing us with a decent source of card advantage as we sack and recur it. Dragonspark Reactor, which gains a charge counter whenever it or another artifact ETBs under our control, letting us pay 4 and sack it to deal damage equal to the number of those counters to target player and creature, quickly turning into a substantial amount of burn with removal attached as we play our artifacts. And finally Moonsilver Key, which we can pay 1 and sack to search our deck for an artifact with a mana ability or basic land and put it into our hand, which we'll be primarily using to tutor up combo pieces that we can use to generate infinite mana with. Speaking of combo pieces, we have 3 of them starting us off as we enter the CMC 3 slot, those being Basalt Monolith, Rings of Brighthearth, and Staff of Domination. Basalt Monolith doesn't untap during our untap step, taps for 3 and lets us pay 3 to untap it, providing us with a substantial amount of mana for its cost that we have to pay back into it to use it again, but in this build serving as a critical combo piece that will help us generate infinite mana. Rings of Brighthearth, whenever we activate a non-mana ability, lets us pay 2 to copy it, allowing us to double up on certain effects such as Basalt Monolith's ability to untap itself for example to generate infinite mana, which we can then combine with mana sinks to win from there. Mana sinks like Staff of Domination, which lets us pay 1 to untap it, pay 2 and tap it to gain a life, pay 3 and tap it to untap target creature, pay 4 and tap it to tap target creature, or pay 5 and tap it to draw a card, making it a classic mana sink that may not win the game for us immediately once we have infinite mana, but does get us infinite life and draw, which will both keep us alive and draw our entire deck for other mana sinks that we can then use to close out the game for us. And then closing out this slot we have Whisper Silk Cloak, an equipment that equips for 2, makes the creature unblockable and grants it Shroud, serving as our last protection piece to ensure we can reasonably get to 1 every game to help keep Meria alive, while also letting her get in for some cheeky damage if needed. Closing in on the end now, the CMC 4 slot starts us off with a pair of damage dealing artifacts in the form of Goblin Cannon and Rocket Launcher, both allowing us to deal 1 damage to any target for 2 mana, the former sacking itself when we do this and the latter needing a full turn before we can use it and destroying itself on the next end step after we use it, each serving as the final piece for our infinite mana combos that, when assembled, can be activated infinite times to deal infinite damage to the entire table and win the game for us on the spot. Empowered Auto Generator then closes out this slot, which comes into play tapped, lets us tap it to put a charge counter on it and then generate X mana of any color, where X is equal to the number of charge counters on it, making it a slow but ever growing source of mana that we can again combo with to generate infinite mana for us and win from there. And finally, reaching the CMC 5 slot and our last artifact, we have Blinkmoth Urn, which, on each player's main one, if it's untapped, produces a colorless mana for that player for each artifact they control, generating us an insane amount of mana to fuel the spells our commander draws for us, and not even benefiting our opponents since we can tap it down ourselves. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Our only Planeswalker joins us in the CMC 4 slot, that being Daretti Scrap Savant, who comes into play with 3 loyalty and has the following abilities. His +2 lets us discard up to 2 cards and then draw up to that many. His -2 lets us sack an artifact, then return an artifact from our graveyard back into play. And his -10 creates an emblem that, whenever an artifact is put into our graveyard from play, returns it to the battlefield on the next end step, making him the perfect means to pitch dead cards from our hand to dig for more low-cost artifacts and combo pieces, as well as being an excellent source of artifact reanimation to help us get our destroyed artifacts right back into play. That covers our Planeswalkers, so let's move on to our land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Mossfire Valley, which we can pay 1 and tap to generate both our colors, Cinderglade, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands, taps for either of our colors and is considered a mountain and a forest, Game Trail, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a mountain or forest and taps for either of our colors, Rockfall Vale, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2+ lands and taps for either of our colors, Temple of Abandon, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs, Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped, and finally, Riveter's Outlook, Evolving Wilds, and Terramorphic Expanse, all of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, the first doing so as soon as it ETBs and gaining us a life, and the latter 2 allowing us to use them at any time. We then have some artifact land additions in the form of Great Furnace and Tree of Tales, which tap for a red and green respectively, Darksteel Citadel, which taps for a colorless and is indestructible, Slagwood's Bridge, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and is also indestructible, and finally Power Depot, which comes into play tapped, taps for either a colorless or any color instead that we can only spend on artifact spells and abilities, and has modular 1. Each pulling double duty as both sources of mana as well as card advantage thanks to our commander. Then lastly, we're running 11 mountains and 8 forests as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've gone over all the cards in the deck, let's briefly go over some of the combos that this build has access to. In this build, we'll have 2 main combos we'll be assembling to generate infinite mana, and then turning that mana into infinite damage to wipe out all our opponent's life totals in one fell swoop. Taking a look at our simplest combo first, the combination of Basalt Monolith plus Rings of Brighthearth and 2 open mana will generate infinite colorless mana for us, which we can then use in conjunction with Rocket Launcher or Goblin Cannon to deal infinite damage, or with Staff of Domination instead to draw our entire deck to get to these while also generating us infinite life. Then moving on to our slightly more complex combo, we can combine Rings of Brighthearth plus Voltaic Key and either an Ever-Flowing Chalice or an Empowered Auto-Generator with 4+ charge counters on them to generate infinite mana, alongside infinite untaps for all our artifacts, allowing us to use the infinite artifact untaps alongside Girapor Aether Grid to deal infinite damage, with Codex Shredder to mill out all our opponents, or with our commander to impulse draw our entire deck, along with the previously mentioned infinite damage and draw sources that we can pump our infinite mana into. I'll also be including a link in the description to both these combos via Commander Spellbook so you can get a step-by-step guide on how to perform them. So, now that we've gone over the combos at our disposal, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 18 creatures including the Commander, 3 instants, 0 sorceries, 1 enchantment, 43 artifacts, 1 Planeswalker, and 34 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 59 cards that are considered artifacts, 18 cards that care about artifacts, and 8 cards that protect our commander from removal, giving us over half a deck's worth of artifacts that Meria can turn into ramp or card advantage, a good number of artifact payoffs to get even more value out of them as they come into play, and a decent number of ways to make Meria as resilient as possible against the inevitable removal attempts that will be coming her way. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 2 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 0 board wipes. Our deck's draw being low since our commander effectively turns all our artifacts into draw, and our wipes being non-existent since we'll be focusing more on getting our combo pieces into play faster than slowing down our opponents, with our ramp and removal falling within more normal ratios. Looking at our mana curve, we have 16 0 drops, 15 1 drops, 15 2 drops, 12 3 drops, 6 4 drops, and 2 5 drops, leaving us with a hyper-aggressive curve that aims to get Meria out quickly, hopefully alongside a protection source to help keep her alive, and then dump as many artifacts onto our field as possible to allow her to dig through our deck for our win cons. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.95, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, Kite Shield, Briber's Purse, and Arichi Hatchery are more zero-cost artifacts we can consider adding to work alongside our commander. Quicksmith Genius is another means to help us dig through our deck for more combo pieces and artifact payoffs. Trash for Treasure is a solid way to get combo pieces back that have been destroyed, and both Creeping Renaissance and Scrap Mastery are superb ways to rebuild our boards if we're unlucky enough to get hit with an artifact-destroying wipe. For upgrades, Shield Sphere is another good zero-drop artifact creature that'll help us get extra mileage out of Meria. Urza's Bauble, Mishra's Bauble, and Lotus Petal are even more zero-drops we can add in that have uses outside of our commander. Lightning Greaves is another excellent piece of protection to help keep Mira alive. Mystic Forge is a great way to let us cast artifacts off the top of our deck without having to use our artifacts to do so. And Walking Ballista, Karn the Great Creator, and Kark Clan Ironworks can be added in alongside other combo pieces to give our deck additional ways to close out games. And finally, if we fancy infuriating the rest of the table, Winter Orb, Trinisphere, and Static Orb are all incredibly oppressive artifacts that will hobble the rest of the table while leaving us unscathed since we can tap them down before the turn gets back to us. And if we added in the previously mentioned Karn the Great Creator, adding in Mycosynth Lattice will prevent our opponents from using any activated abilities, including tapping their lands for mana, though these additions will cost you some significant cash as well as your playgroup. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, I'd like to take a moment to thank the channel subscribers for helping us crack the 6.7k milestone. Thank you all for your continued support, as this channel would be unable to grow without it. Then taking a look at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief was able to handily claim the top spot, so look forward to seeing a Simic spell copying build featuring her next week. Moving on to this week's poll, our contenders this time around will consist of the Rakdos Death and Glorious Combat themed Garna Bloodfist of Keld, the Mono Blue Merfolk Monarch Emperor Mahail II, and the Ruthless Hitman for Hire Ramses Assassin Lord. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and what commanders you want to see from Dominaria United in future polls. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. And speaking of which, I'd like to thank Dark Spectre and Sahir21 for their generous donations. Thanks for the coffee, folks, and thanks for supporting the channel. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.